Muslim immigration from the northwest continued into the 20th century, but the last major empire builders, the Mughals, arrived in India during the early 16th century. Mughal is the Persian word for Mongol, and it's also the root of the modern slang term Mughal. The Mughals acquired this name by claiming descent from two Mongol conquerors, Genghis Khan and Timur Ilang, known in the West as Tamerlane. For most of its early history, the Mughal dynasty sought dominion in Central Asia, especially over the cities of Fargana and Samarkand. These are located in what later became the Soviet republics of Tajikistan and Uzbekistan. In the 1520s, the chief of the Mughal clan, Zahir-ud-Din, was defeated several times by rival chiefs. He tried to re-establish the family's fortunes in the city of Kabul, Afghanistan, but like so many earlier Muslim rulers, he was short of cash. Eventually, Zahir-ud-Din turned his eyes toward India. In 1526, he entered the Indo-Gangetic Plain, the area drained by India's Ganges River, with a small force of 10,000 men. Many of the soldiers were Mongols and Turks who seemed to have trouble pronouncing their leader's Islamic name, Zahir-ud-Din. So they gave him the nickname of Babur, which in Mongolian means the Panther. The nickname stuck, and Zahir-ud-Din has appeared throughout the history books as Babur. Though Babur's force was small, it included a contingent of Turkish artillerymen manning batteries of the latest cannon. The Ottoman Turks were famous for their advanced artillery tactics. Their guns had figured prominently in siege warfare for over a century. But now the Turks had learned how to use cannon on the battlefield. Their strategy was to draw up a line of carts, chain them together, and place the cannon at strategic openings in this wall of wagons. Babur's army would use this innovation with devastating effects. Once across the Khyber Pass, Babur's major opponent was Ibrahim, the Afghan Sultan of Delhi. Babur was outnumbered by 10 to 1, but Ibrahim relied heavily on war elephants and Hindu infantry. At Panipat, north of Delhi, Babur enticed the Delhi army to attack his smaller force, and his artillery had a surprising and horrifying effect. Wounded elephants began to charge backwards, crushing or driving off their own infantry. Even unhurt elephants panicked as guns roared, and their wounded fellows trumpeted. The army of the Delhi Sultan disintegrated, and the Sultan himself was fatally wounded. Babur and his cavalry made short work of the fleeing survivors. A historian in the 16th century described the scene based on details that had been recorded in Babur's memoirs.
Babur's opponent, the Sultan Ibrahim of Delhi, was ignorant in the art of war. He had no plan of battle, but drew up his forces in one great uneven line and ordered them to charge the Mughal army, thinking that his superior numbers would overwhelm them. But he was fatally deceived. The Mughals stood firm, and their artillery did great damage. Ibrahim's column began to break and turn. Those who advanced were repulsed. When they tried to retreat, they found the Mughal cavalry surrounding them. 5,000 men fell on one small patch of ground near Sultan Ibrahim. When Ibrahim was slain, the army recoiled like surges of the sea from a rocky shore. The torrent of their flight reached the river Jamna, but Babur's forces continued their pursuit until his enemy's blood changed the color of that stream.
Babur seized the city of Delhi and its territories. He was generous to the former ruler's family and to the late Sultan's nobles, making every effort to turn them into his own allies. But despite his desire to acquire the wealth of India, Babur never expressed any fondness for the place. He even lamented the kingdom he ruled.
India is a country with few charms. Its climate is not good. They have no good melons or fruits. They have no lovely gardens. The women are not beautiful. They recently brought me a single musk melon. While cutting it up, I felt myself affected with a strong sense of loneliness and a sense of my exile from my native country, and I could not help shedding tears while I was eating it.
Babur was so deeply disappointed with his new empire that he asked to be buried in Kabul, far away from India's heat and dust. Babur had only a few years to regret his Indian success. In December of 1530, his son and successor, Humayun, fell deathly ill. A legendary story reflects Babur's generous character. He offered God his own life in exchange for his son's. Babur began to walk around Humayun's bed. He soon grew too weak to walk, and he lay down. As Babur's strength ebbed, his son began to recover. Legend has it that Humayun regained his health at the moment his father died. Humayun was one of history's tragic figures, a man of great intellect. With all of his father's charm and generosity, Humayun never achieved his full potential. He was beset by internal rebellions, and the Afghans began a war to redress their earlier defeats. By 1540, Humayun became a fugitive, driven into a 15-year exile at the court of the King of Iran. He later returned to India to reclaim his father's domain, supported by a Persian army. After a mere 6 months in Delhi, Humayun was sitting in his library when he heard the call to prayer. He rose to go to the mosque next door, but while going down the stairs, he tripped on his own gown, fell, and died. The British historian Stanley Lane Poole described Humayun.
He stumbled out of life as he had stumbled through it.
Humayun left a 13-year-old son, Jalal-ud-Din, who took the royal name Akbar, which means the greatest. Akbar established the administrative structure of the Mughal Empire. While a youth, one of his father's advisors dominated him, but at age 18, Akbar took imperial power into his own hands. He became the architect of the Mughal imperial system, which to this day looms large in the minds of Indians and Pakistanis. The attitude of these later generations has made Akbar a controversial figure. He's a heretic to some, a hero to others. As Akbar set about creating an empire, he first had to counter the ambitions of the Rajput princes, who were located south of Delhi. These princes opposed him with all their strength. In a number of legendary sieges, Akbar defeated and killed the Maharajas who sought to prevent Mughal expansion. In this way, Akbar was responsible for many more Hindu deaths than any other emperor of his dynasty. When Akbar captured the fortress of Chittor in 1568, many of the Rajput warriors stripped off their clothing, armor, everything except weapons, to launch a final suicide charge. Wives and daughters either jumped to their deaths from the fortress walls or ran into the palace's burning buildings. Akbar ordered any survivors to be immediately executed, but this massacre didn't seem to harm Akbar's reputation as a tolerant, religiously liberal ruler. After their defeats, the Rajputs became the firmest defenders of the Mughal cause. The Rajput princes, who lived beyond the reach of Akbar's wrath, gladly entered the service of the Mughals as generals and warriors. Rajput Maharajas attained the highest ranks in the empire, and they gladly proposed marriages between their daughters and Mughal princes. In time, these Hindu daughters became the mothers of Mughal emperors. Hindus were allowed to practice their religion without fear of repression. A few Muslim scholars protested this tolerance, but most didn't complain. Akbar's official chronicler, Abul Fazl, praised his emperor and castigated those who accused the emperor of impiety.
An impure faction reproached Akbar, the caravan leader of those who follow God, with being of the Brahman's religion. The ground for this improper notion was that the emperor, out of his wide tolerance, received Hindu sages into his intimacy, and increased, for administrative reasons, the ranks of the Hindus, and for the good of the country showed them kindness.
Akbar established a corps of warrior bureaucrats in the Mughal imperial system. These officials were ranked according to the number of horse soldiers they were supposed to send to the imperial army. Entrance requirements and promotions were based almost entirely on merit. Able soldiers and administrators of any religion or social origin could expect to advance if they were absolutely loyal to the emperor. Akbar controlled the nobles by regularly shifting their appointments. A highly placed official might serve as a provincial governor for 2 years, then be recalled to court and given a new assignment. This prevented the officials from acquiring local bases of power from which they might challenge the emperor's authority. Akbar was brave, shrewd, harsh when he needed to be, yet generous by disposition. He was intellectually curious, but he never learned to read or write. So he had books read to him, and he took a keen interest in religious and philosophical issues. Throughout his life, Akbar favored Sufis over Muslim religious scholars, whom he found to be too dogmatic and narrow-minded. Though Akbar came to the throne at age 13, he produced no son and heir until he had ruled for more than 15 years. He made many pilgrimages, sometimes on foot, to the tombs of famous saints. He also associated closely with a living holy man named Sheikh Salim Chishti. In a charming story, Akbar's son, who later became the Emperor Jahangir, tells of this relationship in his memoirs.
One day, my father asked Sheikh Salim, "Will I have sons?" Sheikh Salim answered, "God, the giver, who gives without being asked, will bestow on you 3 sons." My father, in his joy, said, "I ask you to give my firstborn your protection, and I will give him your name to confirm it." When my mother approached the time of delivery, my father sent her to stay in Sheikh Salim's house. And so I received his name. Yet I never heard my father, whether drunk or sober, call me Prince Salim or Sultan Salim, but always the Sheikh's baby.
Akbar's relationship with his son was stormy. At a young age, Prince Salim fell in love with a dancing girl, Anarkali. Akbar disapproved of this infatuation with a low-born entertainer, so he put an end to the affair by having Anarkali buried alive. Prince Salim staged the first of several rebellions against his father, but Akbar remained loyal to his troublesome son. He eventually forgave Salim and retained him as his chosen heir. As Akbar grew older, his affections focused increasingly on his grandson, Salim's oldest son, Prince Khusro. Yet Akbar would not abandon Mughal custom, which dictated that the eldest son inherit the throne. When Salim became the Emperor Jahangir, he put Khusro under house arrest. And as a token for an old love, he ordered a tomb built over Anarkali's grave. The story of the imperial family throughout the Mughal period reads like a modern soap opera. But somehow their individual flaws and failings did not subtract from the respect they acquired. And the Mughals' reputation outlasted their real power. For example, as late as 1947, when someone told a Rajput peasant that the British were leaving Delhi, he fondly remembered the Mughals.
That's good. Now the Mughals will come back again.
Akbar's imperial system was so strong that it survived the reign of his son Jahangir. Jahangir was a man with many talents, but politics was not among them. According to legend, Jahangir could distinguish between the paintings of one artist or another by merely glancing at the brushstrokes. He was a keen observer of nature and wrote a fascinating memoir of his life. But he was too fond of wine and opium to take much interest in governing the empire. Of all the Mughal emperors, Jahangir's son, Shah Jahan, is best known by Americans. Shah Jahan ruled for 30 years up until 1658, and Mughal power reached its highest point during his reign. Shah Jahan erected a mausoleum in the city of Agra for his favorite wife. It took 17 years to complete and was finished in 1649. Today, it's one of the most famous buildings in the world, one of the 7 wonders, the Taj Mahal. A Persian history of the period described its beauty.
And in that beautiful and heart-pleasing place in Agra, a tomb like that found in paradise was laid out, and a dome of exalted foundation and a magnificent building was founded, the like and peer of which the eye of this age has not seen beneath the 9 vaults of the heavens, and of the resemblance and equal of which the ears of this time have not heard, not even in the past ages. And the master builders and architects, who were all of discerning eye, estimated that it would cost 2 million silver coins, and that when it would be completed, it would be the masterpiece of the days to come and an astonishment to all of humanity.
Shah Jahan was intensely interested in architecture, and he reigned over India's golden age of Muslim architecture. The central mosque of Old Delhi became well known, and the Red Fort of Delhi contained the peacock throne, studded with countless gems. In 1658, Shah Jahan became gravely ill, and everyone assumed he would die. His 4 sons began to fight over the throne. The eldest, Dara Shikoh, had been Shah Jahan's favorite, but he proved to be no match for a coalition of 2 of his younger brothers. Dara's army was defeated, and eventually he was beheaded. Among the three younger brothers, Aurangzeb quickly emerged as the most able. In turn, he managed to crush and execute his siblings. He came to the throne in 1659 with the royal name Alamgir, meaning world conqueror. The father, Shah Jahan, survived his illness, but he lived out his days as a prisoner under house arrest. Alamgir was a shrewd diplomat and a tireless military campaigner. He spent much of his reign in southern India, conquering the last of the Muslim kingdoms. He also tried to suppress rebels who opposed the Mughal conquest. Typically, Alamgir preferred bribery to force. He offered lucrative appointments to rebels or to nobles from enemy factions. This policy was initially successful, but it began to strain the empire's resources as too many people looked for official posts. To make matters worse, Alamgir's long campaigns in the south encouraged administrative decay in the north. Officers began to refuse transfers to new jobs, fearing that newly conquered lands would not provide enough income to maintain their status. To modern-day Pakistanis and Indians, Alamgir is a controversial figure. Unlike most of his ancestors, he didn't drink wine, use opium, or take more than the 4 wives sanctioned by Muslim law. Alamgir was pious and austere. When not engaged in the business of state, he knitted prayer caps or copied out the Quran. He sold these items to his courtiers. With this money, he could pay for his own burial shroud and grave. He forbade the building of a magnificent tomb for himself. He was content to have a simple earthen grave next to that of his favorite Sufi teacher. Later generations have interpreted Alamgir's personal piety as religious fanaticism. He's reported to have been a zealot who alienated Hindus by promoting Islamic orthodoxy. But this charge has been exaggerated. Alamgir continued to provide government grants to Hindu priests and institutions. He did tax Hindu pilgrims, though probably due to the empire's financial needs rather than religious bigotry. Moreover, Alamgir used his authority to protect Hindus, as in this imperial decree.
In these days of justice, information has reached our noble and most holy court that certain persons interfere and harass the Hindu residents of Benares and its neighborhood and the Brahmin keepers of the temples, and that they further desire to remove these Brahmins from their ancient offices. And this intimidation of theirs causes distress to that community. Therefore, our royal command is that after the arrival of this order, you should direct that in the future no person shall in unlawful ways interfere or disturb the Brahmins and other Hindu residents at these places, so that they may, as before, remain in their occupation and continue with peace of mind to offer prayers for the continuance of our God-given empire, so that it may last forever. Treat this order as urgent.
Alamgir died in 1707 at age 89 after a 47-year reign. But his longevity probably hurt the empire. His sons tottered off to fight one another in the War of Succession, but they were themselves old men in their 60s. The battles over the throne lasted some 5 years, and the winner had merely 2 years to enjoy the prize before he died. Another war of succession followed, and the imperial administration continued to disintegrate. Mughal authority became obviously weaker, so provincial governors and local strongmen began fighting with one another to expand their control. New leaders appeared with obscure social pedigrees, and groups like the Marathas of western India came forward to contend for power. The Marathas began as warrior peasants in the area called Maharashtra. They were skilled with swords and muskets, and they became a mobile force by using small, locally bred ponies to raid and plunder outside their home region. The Marathas were no match for the Mughal army's heavily armored cavalry, but they soon learned the art of guerrilla warfare. When pursued, they melted into the nooks and crannies of their native hills. The Mughal troopers would be called away, and the Marathas would emerge again to cause trouble. Gangaram, a Bengali poet, described a Maratha raid in the 1740s.
The Marathas came up and encircled some fleeing villagers on the plain. They snatched away gold and silver, rejecting all else. Of some people, they cut off the hand, of some the nose and ears. Some they killed outright. They dragged away the beautiful women. After looting in the open, they entered the villages. They set fire to the houses, large and small, temples and dwelling places. After burning the villages, they roamed on all sides plundering. "Give us rupees! Give us rupees! Give us rupees!" they shouted. When they got no rupees, they poured water into the nostrils of their victims or drowned them in tanks. Some they suffocated. Those who had money gave it to them. Those who had none gave up their lives.
The Mughals tried bribery and repression to eliminate the Maratha threat, but each effort brought only limited success. One of the Maratha chiefs, Shivaji, was particularly adept at playing politics in this cycle of rebellion, temporary submission, then renewed rebellion. The Marathas were only 2 generations away from being mere village strongmen, but they soon became a major force in the politics of North and Central India. By the middle of the 18th century, the Maratha chiefs were trying to control the Mughal emperor himself. The Mughals no longer had much power, but they still enjoyed great prestige. Every new warlord still wanted to have the Mughal emperor's approval. The Mughal dynasty was to survive until 1859, but few of the emperors who followed Alamgir approached the early Mughals in wealth and power. Political change in India has often expressed itself through new religious movements. Some gurus or teachers have wanted to abandon the well-known faiths of Islam and Hinduism. For example, Nanak, originally a Hindu, led the development of a new devotional contemplative religion in the early 1500s, but he died in 1539. 9 other gurus followed Nanak. Each claimed to possess the same spirit of God that had possessed Nanak. A community of faith, the Khalsa, gradually took shape under those 10 teachers. Those outside the movement called its followers Sikhs, a word meaning student or disciple. Among themselves, believers referred to themselves as Panthis, meaning people following the same path. Sikh gurus teach that there is only one God, and this teaching is codified in their holy book, the Sri Guru Adi Granth.
There is one God. Eternal truth is his name. Maker of all things, fearing nothing, and at enmity with nothing. Timeless is his image, not begotten, being of his own being, by the grace of the Guru made known to men.
To the Sikhs, all other known religions have lost touch with that one true God. As the Sikhs say, we are not Hindu, we are not Muslim. Each of the 10 gurus came from urban, mercantile backgrounds, but most of their followers came from the Jats, a caste of warrior peasants in India's state of Punjab. Sikhs emphasize that all of the faithful are equal. As their holy book says,
In the womb of his mother, no man knows his caste. All men are born from God's one spirit. What makes you a Brahmin, and I merely a Shudra? If blood runs in my veins, does milk flow in yours?
Guru Nanak and most of his successors preached nonviolence, but the last guru, Gobind Singh, responded to persecution by turning the community of faith into a militant organization. He ordered all male Sikhs to take a special baptism and use the name Singh, which means lion. Women took the name Kaur, meaning pure. No male was allowed to cut his hair or trim his beard. This set Sikhs apart from Hindus, who customarily shave their faces and heads. Sikh militancy was expressed in 4 other commands of Gobind Singh. Males must keep their long hair tied with a comb to prevent their enemies from grabbing it in battle. They should wear loose-fitting pants which end above the knee, enabling them to move more freely in battle. They should always carry a short sword and wear a steel bangle as a symbol of their strength. And finally, Gobind Singh announced that after his death there would be no more living gurus. Henceforth, the Spirit of God would reside in a book containing poems by the 10 gurus and religious poetry by respected Hindu and Muslim saints. Known as the Sri Guru Adi Granth Sahib, this book is the guide for all who accept baptism into the Sikh community. The Sikh homeland in the Punjab region is very fertile in some sections. For that reason, nearby Delhi kingdoms have often exploited the area for its surplus grain. Punjabi farmers, whether Sikh or not, have usually resisted demands for tribute from both local and external authorities. But the Sikhs introduced a new religious fervor to this traditional tax resistance. In 1716, a Mughal general severely defeated the Sikhs, but the Sikhs were remarkably tenacious. The British historian Vincent Smith described the revival of their fortunes.
The Sikh remnant in the Punjab hills, though apparently leaderless as well as stateless, was held together by a body of doctrine which made them look upon themselves as a chosen people, and by a ritual of daily life which underlined their separateness, both to themselves and to others. The troubles of the 1750s were their opportunity. Their advance was rapid but disorderly. No strong chief existed to check them, but no accepted leader directed their movements. They spread over the Punjab in a number of war bands, gaining converts and recruits as they proceeded, gradually forming themselves into a number of embryo states.
These Sikh kingdoms were to survive until the 1840s when the British would conquer them. Among all the forces competing for influence in 18th century India, Europeans began to make their presence felt. The Portuguese had been the first to arrive near the very end of the 15th century. Over the next 100 years, they had tried to control the trade on the Arabian Sea and Indian Ocean. But Portugal itself was a poor agricultural country, and its international empire builders didn't have enough support at home. In the end, Portugal kept only 2 small enclaves on India's west coast. India finally conquered them in 1961. The Dutch then had a turn at trying to monopolize the India trade, but their operations gradually concentrated on the Spice Islands, far to the southeast in what is today Indonesia. Dutch interest in India began to fade into insignificance. By the late 1700s, the British and the French were the only European powers with a chance at creating an Indian empire. Britain's Queen Elizabeth I gave a charter to the East India Company on December 31st, 1600. After a shaky beginning, the company's trade grew steadily. A British trading station was set up at Surat on the west coast. Another at Fort St. George on the southeast coast was to become the city of Madras. Fort William in Bengal, far to the east, was to become Calcutta. Then, in 1669, the British acquired the island of Bombay on the west coast. Eventually, Bombay would become a commercial metropolis with few rivals in the world. At the beginning, the British staked their trade on concessions granted by the Mughal emperors. They presented suitable gifts to the ruler, and they received various imperial charters that exempted them from transit duties. But when Mughal power began to wane in the 18th century, the British found local rulers less willing to heed imperial orders. The British were pressured to pay more and more in local taxes. India's petty princes threatened violence, so the British began to arm and train soldiers. Some of them were Europeans, a motley collection of castaways and deserters from ships. Many of the soldiers were not British, but Danes, Swedes, Frenchmen, and Dutch. Still, iron discipline shaped them into an organized body of troops. But there were always too few Europeans, so the British recruited and trained Indians, mostly warrior peasants. These Indian warriors got European-style weapons, uniforms, and training, and were supervised by British officers. The British called them sepoys, a corrupt pronunciation of the Persian sipahi, for a mounted trooper. The French also trained and armed Indians. Britain's military leader in the mid-18th century came from a somewhat unlikely source. Robert Clive had been the ne'er-do-well son of a middle-class English family. Rather than tolerate his failures, they had obtained for him a job as a clerk in the British East India Company. He went to India in 1744, and it's been said he went to make a fortune or die of a fever. Clive was a restless young man, completely bored by accounts and ledgers. He became so depressed that one day he put a pistol to his head and pulled the trigger. The gun misfired, and Clive came to believe that God had destined him for greater things. In 1746, the French appeared to have the upper hand in South India. Under a brilliant politician and general, Joseph Dupleix, they captured Madras, bagging a number of British prisoners, including young Robert Clive. Also in that year, Dupleix took a force of 200 Frenchmen, added 700 Indians trained by the French, supplied them with a few cannon, and defeated an Indian army of more than 10,000. Both foreigners and natives could see that European tactics would soon dominate Indian battlefields. In response to these victories, the board of directors of the French East India Company could only warn Dupleix.
The company fears that so audacious a plan for the conquest of South India will create an implacable hatred against us without any financial gain, and that our establishments in the Ganges basin will be its victim.
The government of Louis XV of France had little interest in India and didn't support its agents there. It ordered Dupleix back to France in 1754 for wasting money on adventures that did not turn a profit. Meanwhile, Robert Clive came into his own as a soldier. He volunteered to command what seemed to be a harebrained expedition. With 200 European soldiers and 300 Indians, he marched straight into the fortress of the Nawab of Arcot, an Indian prince at war with the British. Fortunately for Clive, the Nawab and most of his army were elsewhere. When the Nawab and his army of 4,000 returned to the fortress, Clive led a heroic defense that lasted 50 days. Finally, reinforcements arrived to relieve Clive's force. Clive became an overnight celebrity, and he found that he could have any military command of his choice. In 1756, more trouble arose, this time between the British and the ruler of Bengal, Siraj-ud-Dowlah. Without Bengali permission, the British began fortifying their settlement at Calcutta. This insulted Siraj's dignity, and he attacked Fort William with 50,000 men. Most of the British, including the governor, ran for their boats, leaving behind only 170 soldiers and a number of women and children. After token resistance, the garrison surrendered. This led to an incident which was to haunt the British memory throughout their time in India. A number of prisoners in Calcutta, some sources say 146, others say 64, were shut up overnight in a small room with poor ventilation. The next morning, only 23 of them were alive. That room became known as the famous Black Hole of Calcutta. For generations of Englishmen, it supported their attitude that Indians were uncivilized. As the Indian author Nirad Chaudhry noted,
retrospectively, the Black Hole incident served to throw a moral halo over the British conquest of India, as if it was God's punishment for iniquity, an historical illustration of the Sanskrit saying, where there is righteousness, there is victory.
In 1757, Britain sent an expedition from Madras to Calcutta under Robert Clive. By now, he held the rank of lieutenant colonel. His force consisted of 900 Europeans, 1,500 Indians, and 10 British warships. But meanwhile, the 7 Years' War, known in America as the French and Indian Wars, had begun. Britain was again at war with France. Hearing that hostilities were underway in Europe, Clive and the naval commander, Admiral Watson, first attacked and captured a French outpost. Having eliminated the French presence in Bengal, they turned their attention to the Indian prince, Siraj. Using money from prominent Hindu bankers in Calcutta, Clive picked one of Siraj's relations, Mir Jafar, and supported him as a rival claimant to the throne. On June 23, 1757, with a force of 2,800 men, Clive met Siraj's army of 50,000 at a place the British call Plassey. Clive's agents had bribed many of the opposing soldiers with the money from Calcutta bankers. A few volleys were exchanged, then most of Siraj's army deserted. The British won the day and soon installed their candidate as ruler of Bengal. Siraj retreated, only to be murdered a few days later by his remaining troopers. His body came floating down the Hooghly River, and his soldiers accepted this as a sign of a new order. After the victory, Clive received cash gifts from the new ruler with a value of almost 300,000 British pounds sterling. The victory at Plassey now made him one of the richest men in England. No one, least of all Clive, seemed to be terribly concerned about what we would now consider to be political corruption. And Clive was never alone in seeking or finding a personal fortune in India. Yet, within a few years, Englishmen back home began to show contempt for this new money. The Indo-Persian term for a governor, Nawab, was corrupted into the derisive English term, Nabob. Many Englishmen began to complain about those who used official posts to loot India. Edmund Burke eventually attacked them in Parliament and warned about future corruption.
Animated with all the avarice of age and all the impetuosity of youth, they roll in one after another, wave after wave, and there is nothing before the eyes of the natives but an endless, hopeless prospect of new flights of birds of prey and passage, with appetites continually renewing for a food that is continually running out.
Clive found that buying his way into the upper reaches of British society didn't satisfy him. In 1774, he committed suicide. Nirad Chaudhry, one of Clive's biographers, considered the hero's fate in England.
A stable and static English society tried to digest this Englishman remade in India. Had Clive remained a normal East Indian nabob, it would have absorbed him. But with each period of activity in India, his achievements became more grandiose, his outlook more exotic, and his idea of what was due him more overpitched. English society found him too big, too strange, and too intractable for reclamation. England profited by his ability and achievements, but destroyed him personally.
Historians generally agree that Clive's victory at Plassey in 1757 marked the starting point for British dominion in India. But the Battle of Buxar, which occurred 7 years later in 1764, was a much more significant British victory. There, the British defeated a coalition including the Mughal emperor, the governor of Oudh, and the new ruler of Bengal. The beaten Mughal emperor was forced to install British representatives as imperial treasurers for the province of Bengal. For the British, this new influence in the Bengali government solved a long-standing financial problem. For years, the British had been required to pay in silver for the goods they purchased in India. Britain had little that Indians would accept and trade. British wool wasn't much in demand in India's hot climate, and Indian steel and iron were then as good as Britain's. So the British engineered one of history's most elaborate exchanges of wealth. Silver, mined in South America by slaves for the Spaniards, was pirated from Spanish galleons by the British. This silver, in turn, was sent to India to pay for cotton cloth and other trade goods. The British were now the treasurers of Bengal, and they could expect to receive most of the land tax from the province. The British thought they would obtain more than enough silver to buy all the Indian cloth they required without draining England's own stocks of this precious metal. The British became treasurers of Bengal in hope of gaining a monetary advantage, but they were soon frustrated. Indians knew the country better than the British did, so Indian subordinates were able to pocket the revenue before the British ever saw it. In 1770, Bengal sank into one of the worst famines the region had ever experienced. No one has been able to determine the number of dead with certainty, but estimates range between 3 and 6 million. Company officers paid little attention to the death around them. The directors of the East India Company in London finally complained that Englishmen were profiting by the universal distress of the miserable natives. But the British did nothing to relieve the famine. One author described Bengal during this time.
The husbandmen sold their cattle. They sold their implements of agriculture. They devoured their seed grain. They sold their sons and their daughters, till at length no buyer of children could be found. They ate the leaves of the trees and the grass of the field. And by June 1770, the living were feeding on the dead. Interment could not do its work quick enough. Even dogs and jackals, the public scavengers, became unable to accomplish their revolting work, and a multitude of mangled and festering corpses at length threatened the existence of the citizens.
Faced with a dramatic loss of income, the British decided to take a more aggressive role in governing Bengal. An East India Company official, Warren Hastings, had grown up in the company's service. He was now a Persian scholar and a diplomat. In 1772, Hastings became the Governor-General at Fort William, and he wanted to end the administrative incompetence in Bengal. British policy had been to let Indians govern the country, while the British sat back to enjoy the profits. Now, Hastings wanted company employees to become directly involved in ruling Bengal's population. He believed this would put an end to the chaos gripping the region. The young Englishmen who were working for the company in India found themselves increasingly engaged in government rather than commerce. Throughout almost 200 years of British rule in India, officials often disagreed about the correct policy to pursue. Some wished to expand the scope of government, to conquer new territories, and gradually to supplant Indian practices with British ones. Others advocated caution, trying to avoid political intrigues and imperial expansion. They wanted to let native custom overrule British ideas of government. But neither approach ever won out. It's virtually impossible to generalize about British government in India, but for good or bad, British rule remained one of contemporary South Asia's most significant influences. Even Indian anti-imperialists would speak the English language to express contempt for the British. No single governmental style emerged in the parts of India directly controlled by the British. In some provinces, the administration believed that local landholders constituted an aristocracy that ought to be supported. In Bengal, for example, the British created a revenue system known as the permanent settlement. A fixed number of so-called landlords were given absolute title to their estates. They were responsible for paying the government tax at a rate supposedly to be fixed forever. In this way, the British hoped to secure a stable income. But in other regions of South Asia, the British decided that big landlords were parasites. Landowners were retired with pensions, and the government tried to deal directly with the peasant cultivators. None of these arrangements was wholly satisfactory, but the British were able to collect their revenues with unprecedented efficiency. Throughout their rule, land taxes accounted for about 85% of the government's budget. Even in famine years, the revenue shortfall was never more than 5%. The greatest British influences on India's population turned out to be collecting revenues and enforcing notions of private property. But even the British could never agree whether their revenue system benefited Indians. W. Hunter described the impact of the permanent settlement on Muslim landlords in Bengal.
The greatest wrong we did to the Muslim aristocracy was in defining their rights. Up to that period, their title had not been permanent, but neither had it been fixed. We gave them their tenures in perpetuity, but in so doing, we rendered them inelastic.
By the 1850s, the Indian population was becoming obviously discontented over several issues. These boiled over in 1857, especially in North India, leading to what the British referred to as the Mutiny. Modern Indian nationalists call it India's first war of independence. As early as 1817, Sir Thomas Munro, the governor of Madras, seemed to locate the root cause of later troubles.
The advantages of British rule are dearly bought. They are purchased by the sacrifice of independence, of national character, of whatever renders a people respectable. The consequence, therefore, of the conquest of India by British arms would be, in place of raising, to debase a whole people. There is perhaps no example of any conquest in which the natives have been so completely excluded from any share of the government of their country as in British India.
Only a few regions of the country and only part of the population involved themselves in the mutiny, so it really cannot be classified as a war of independence. On the other hand, it was much more than a soldiers' riot, which the word mutiny implies. The first signs of trouble occurred when Indian soldiers in East India Company's army refused to obey orders. They sometimes would kill their officers, loot markets, and then run off. Several Indian regiments in this army were stationed in Meerut, a town in northern India about 40 miles east of Delhi. The soldiers there had several grievances. Many had been recruited as warrior peasants from the independent kingdom of Oudh, and in 1856 the British annexed Oudh and exiled its ruler. The soldiers could only grumble at this tampering with the status of their homeland. But more immediately, the army was introducing a new Enfield rifle. Part of the loading procedure for this weapon required the soldier to bite off the end of a paper cartridge containing gunpowder and a bullet. After pouring the powder down the rifle barrel, the soldier then rammed in the bullet, and the paper of the cartridge was greased to make the ramming easier. A rumor spread that these cartridges were covered with either cow fat or pig fat. Both Muslim and Hindu soldiers were convinced these cartridges were part of a plot to make them impure in the eyes of the faithful. Such impurity would require followers of either faith to convert to Christianity. The British had robbed them of their homeland, and now the soldiers believed that the British wanted to take away their religion as well. Individual soldiers and entire regiments refused to accept the new rifles, and the British imposed stern punishments. They dismissed some of the recalcitrant troops, depriving soldiers of their income. Some were put in chains and imprisoned. At Meerut, this smoldering resentment erupted on a Sunday in May 1857. Indian regiments were drawn up to witness their comrades being punished, while the European troops of the garrison were off at church services. Faced with humiliation, the Indians attacked their officers, released the imprisoned soldiers, and began marching to Delhi. In all the confusion, common criminals in the Meerut Bazaar saw a chance for plunder. They attacked the shops of the market and looted several British homes. During the chaos, a number of British women were raped and murdered. These were only the first of many atrocities committed by both sides during a conflict that would last nearly 2 years. The commander of the Meerut garrison, an old man, had a fit when he heard of these incidents. He fell into a stupor, during which he issued no orders. Equally old and infirm subordinates failed to take action. As a result, the rebels escaped to Delhi. The British had only a token force at Delhi. This was a mark of respect for the Mughals, who now were merely pensioners of the East India Company. The rebels quickly defeated this small British force, then fled to the palace to plead their case with the Emperor Bahadur Shah II. Bahadur Shah was aged and enfeebled. Some say he was senile. At the sound of the rebels breaking in, Bahadur Shah hid in a closet. The soldiers eventually found him, coaxed him out of his hiding place, and informed him that he was restored to power as emperor. Whether consciously or unconsciously, willingly or unwillingly, Bahadur Shah became the chief symbol of the rebellion. Under his name and imperial seal, many declarations were made, including the following.
It is well known to all that in this age, the people of Hindustan, both Hindus and Muslims, are being ruined by the tyranny and oppression of the infidel and treacherous English. It is therefore the bounden duty of all the wealthy people of India to take their lives and property for the well-being of the public.
In a number of districts in North India, the peasant farmers rose up. They attacked any resident Englishman, but often their main targets were the government's revenue offices and the homes of moneylenders. The uprising became a popular revolt. In other Indian towns, the British forces were hard-pressed, but they hung on. In Lucknow, capital of the recently annexed kingdom of Oudh, mutineers and rebels besieged the residence of the British Chief Commissioner. The Residency managed to hold out through what one participant called a season in hell. The defenders were relieved in November after a 5-month siege. During those long months, they were short of food and water. They suffered outbreaks of cholera and were constantly peppered by enemy fire. Women and children also died from disease and stray bullets. The defense of the Residency entered British mythology as one of the most glorious moments in the history of the empire. Alfred Lord Tennyson, the poet laureate of England, memorialized these events in his poem, The Defense of Lucknow.
Ever the day with its traitorous death from the loopholes around. Ever the night with its coffinless corpse to be laid in the ground. Heat like the mouth of a hell or a deluge of cataract skies. Stench of old, awful, decaying, and infinite torture of flies. Thoughts of the breezes of May blowing over an English field. Cholera, scurvy, and fever. The wound that would not be healed.
But as Jawaharlal Nehru noted,
There is no memorial for the Indians who died.
elsewhere in North India, the British were defeated. At Kanpur, they were surrounded. The commander surrendered to the rebels with the understanding that everyone would receive a safe conduct out of the town. The British force, including many women and children, made their way to the boats meant to take them away, but fighting broke out. All but 4 of the English soldiers were killed, and the women and children were imprisoned for a time. But the Indian rebels apparently wanted to remove any witnesses to the massacre, so they brutally murdered the British women and children, then threw their bodies into a well. Such acts enraged the British. They were to fear these kinds of incidents for the rest of the time they governed India. Rebels in the various regions suffered from a lack of unified leadership. Soldiers fought bravely as individuals and small units, but under the imperial system, the senior officers were always British. Indian officers could maneuver squads and companies, but they had no experience at commanding battalions or brigades. When they confronted larger British forces, they invariably lost. The British quickly reinforced their troops in India by tapping into the resources of their worldwide empire and by using steamships. Many regions within India remained calm, and this further aided the British cause. The rebellion was restricted almost entirely to the north and a few places in central India, but even there, many groups remained loyal to the British. The Sikhs of the Punjab traditionally had looked upon the Mughal emperors as their oppressors, so they had no enthusiasm for joining a rebellion with a Mughal as its figurehead. The Sikhs in the army remained true to their salt. Likewise, the Gurkhas, a tribe from Nepal, felt no attachment to the Indian rebels. So a corps of Indians loyal to Britain, together with fresh British troops, slowly began to reconquer rebel territories. In the process, The British themselves revenged the atrocities at Meerut and Cawnpur with atrocities of their own. For example, if a man with a common name like Muhammad Hussein was a known rebel, then any man with the same name was in danger of being seized, given the briefest of trials, and hanged for the crimes of his namesake. One British judge claimed that he could smell a rebel, so he simply sniffed any prisoner, releasing or executing him according to what he called his nose for the evidence. For some notorious rebels, the British employed an old Mughal punishment, being blown from a gun. Here, a prisoner was tied to a cannon with the muzzle of the gun flat against his midsection. The cannon was then discharged, having, as one British officer commented, a salutary effect on anyone witnessing the procedure. The swift justice meted out by the British was described by one witness.
Soldiers and civilians alike were holding a bloody assize, or slaying the natives without any assize at all, regardless of age or sex. The aged, women, and children are sacrificed, as well as those guilty of rebellion. They were not deliberately hanged, but burnt to death in villages, perhaps now and then accidentally shot. Volunteer hanging parties went into the districts, and amateur executioners were not wanting to the occasion. One gentleman boasted of the numbers he had finished off, in an artistic manner, with mango trees for gibbets and elephants for drops, the victims of this wild justice being strung up, as though for a pastime in figures of 8.
After crushing the revolt of 1857, the British set about reorganizing their Indian empire. The East India Company was relieved of its duty to govern India, and all Indian administration was placed directly under the Crown. In 1877, Queen Victoria was declared Empress of India, thus securing India's status as jewel in the crown of the British Empire. This was the high point of British dominion in India, also known as the Raj, from the Sanskrit word for rule. After the British succeeded the Mughals, there were dozens of administrative changes in both civilian and military spheres. Many new miles of telegraph line were built, and railroad tracks were laid at a furious pace. In 1859, India had only 432 miles of railway track. By 1869, there were 5,000 miles of track. By the end of the 19th century, there were 25,000 miles. Surface roads were similarly expanded and improved. The British undertook this work for military reasons. They wanted to be able to crush any future rebellion more quickly. Yet the British were not the only ones to benefit. The economy boomed in many regions of India. Peasants and craftsmen used the roads and railways to get their goods to market. Indians became some of the world's most inveterate train travelers. Whether to visit relatives, to do business, or to go on pilgrimage, Indians avidly used the trains. And it was a habit that stuck. By 1990, excluding commuter trains, India's railways would carry an average of 12 million people per day. Some British officials in the mid to late 19th century came to believe that the Indians had revolted because the British had lost touch with Indian opinion. Men who spent years in India had thought falsely that they knew their people. Now, to counteract this information gap, administrators began to invite selected Indians to act as semi-official counselors. District administrators were encouraged to consult with local leaders. The British often asked government employees, wealthy merchants, or other notables to provide information. These people were perhaps not representative, but the Indians were able to begin participating in Britain's imperial government. A man named Syed Ahmad was a good example of the kind of individual the British favored. Born in 1817, Syed came from a prominent family of Delhi. His ancestors were courtiers of the Mughal emperors, but by the time Syed came of age, the Mughal court offered few opportunities for a bright, ambitious young man. Syed Ahmad's uncle worked for the British as a subordinate judge, so the young man sat in his uncle's office learning government procedures by observing them. Eventually, Syed Ahmad gained employment with the British, serving as a district judge until he retired in 1876. The revolt of 1857 presented a turning point in Syed Ahmad's career. During the struggle, he remained absolutely loyal to the British. He even risked his own life to save a number of Englishmen and his district's cash box. He expressed no sympathy for the rebels, and he actually praised the benefits of British rule.
The turmoil of violence which happened was only a punishment for the ungratefulness of the Indians. In India, people are not at all accustomed to learn about former times from the facts of history nor from reading books. It is for this reason that you people were not acquainted with the injustice and oppression that used to take place in the days of past rulers. If you had been acquainted with the injustice and excesses of past days, you would have appreciated the value of English rule and given thanks to God.
Even before the revolt, Sayyid Ahmad had been noticed by a number of his British superiors. Apart from his abilities as a judge, he was a scholar and religious reformer. His fame from the revolt only enhanced the respect some administrators already had for him, and Sayyid reached the topmost rungs of Britain's imperial system. When he visited England in 1869, he was introduced to Queen Victoria and the Prince of Wales. In the same year, the British awarded Sayyid Ahmad the rank of Commander in the Order of the Star of India. In 1888, he received a knighthood, creating the title by which most South Asians came to know him, Sir Sayyid. And he went on to found a school, the Muhammadan Anglo-Oriental College, in the city of Aligarh, 60 miles to the south and east of Delhi. Other Muslims sometimes mocked Sir Sayyid's educational efforts. One satirical poet wrote an epitaph for the accomplishments of Aligarh graduates.
They shuffled paper, they collected their pensions, and they died.
Sir Sayyid did his best to ignore his detractors. He constantly repeated the point that education was fundamental to the progress of Muslims in India. As he wrote,
The cause of England's civilization is that all the arts and sciences are in the language of the country. Those who are really bent on improving and bettering India must remember that the only way of compassing this is by having the whole of the arts and sciences translated into their own language. I should like to have this written in gigantic letters on the Himalayas for the remembrance of future generations. If they be not translated, India can never be civilized. This is the truth. This is the truth. This is the truth.
Many of Aligarh's graduates got government jobs, and many became judges and lawyers in the British-controlled courts. Sir Sayyid came to depend on the British to support his school and other activities. He also spent countless hours traveling from town to town, trying to interest upper-middle-class Muslims in British-style education. To some extent, he succeeded. Many of these families sent their sons to Aligarh. As Sir Sayyid traveled from one speaking engagement to another, he began to perfect an Urdu rhetorical style, which had applications to the political scene. Persian, not Urdu, had previously been the language of serious discourse. Urdu had been a vernacular whose poetry was much prized, but until Sir Sayyid's day, no one used it for political oratory. Sir Sayyid was not alone in his efforts. Other would-be politicians were taking the stage. At first, they mostly were interested in specific causes, in education, in social reform, in local affairs. These would-be Indian politicians were usually moderate, and they frequently proclaimed their loyalty to the British. But by the end of the 19th century, their attitudes had started to change. Indians first expressed their cultural and political identity in voluntary associations. One of the earliest of these associations was the Brahmo Samaj, the Society of God, founded in Calcutta in 1828. This society's members were well-to-do and well-educated in both Bengali and English. They discussed theology and philosophy, seeking to give a common understanding to disparate Hindu beliefs and practices. They hoped this would counteract the criticisms of Christian missionaries. Ram Mohan Roy, the guiding light of the Brahmo, was a close friend to many American and British Unitarians. The Brahmo Samaj thus fostered a Hindu theology that in many ways resembled Unitarian beliefs. Keshub Chunder Sen, the grandson of a friend of Ram Mohan Roy, stated the case against missionary criticisms.
Europeans and natives of India are both the children of God, and the ties of brotherhood should bind them together. Extend then to us, O you Europeans in India, the right hand of friendship, to which we are fairly entitled. If, however, our Christian friends persist in insulting our nationality and national character, and in distrusting and hating Orientals, let me assure them that I do not in the least feel dishonored by the imputations. On the contrary, I rejoice. Yes, I am proud that I am an Asiatic. And was not Jesus Christ an Asiatic?
The Brahmo Samaj and other 19th century organizations addressed a number of social concerns. They worked to abolish the Hindu practice of child marriage, where boys and girls could wed even when they were 7 or 8. The young man and wife did not live together until they reached puberty, but they were still bound by the vows of marriage. If the boy died, the little girl became a widow. Hindu custom, especially among the upper classes, forbade the remarriage of widows. Many little girls, therefore, suffered in this way. Since they could not remarry, they became burdens to their parents and brothers or lived as virtual slaves to their in-laws. Sati was another of India's most notorious social traditions. The word sati means virtuous woman, and the social norms of a sati demanded that a wife should be totally devoted to her husband. At his death, rather than face a widow's miserable existence, she should prove herself to be a virtuous woman by lying on her husband's funeral pyre and being immolated. Historically, such dedication was rare. It was a custom restricted almost entirely to the upper classes and was not common even there. But a husband's relatives did sometimes take the opportunity to get rid of an unwanted female. They drugged the wife, tied her up, and forced her to become a sati. The British forbade the custom, and Indian reformers joined them in condemning it. Indeed, Ram Mohan Roy wrote vigorously in defense of women's equality.
Women are, in general, inferior to men in bodily strength and energy. Consequently, the male part of the community, taking advantage of their corporeal weakness, has denied to them those excellent merits that they are entitled to by nature, and afterwards are apt to say that women are naturally incapable of acquiring those merits. As to women's inferiority in point of understanding, when did males ever afford them a fair opportunity of exhibiting their natural capacity?
The Brahmo Samaj also took the lead in reinterpreting India's religious history. While Hindus and Muslims generally had lived in peace, some Hindu thinkers started to blame the Muslims for a whole range of religious and social ills. Ram Mohan Roy was one of the first Indian thinkers to employ this tactic. He said that India once had a golden age in which its religion and society operated on the loftiest principles. Muslim invaders, he argued, ruined that perfection. He blamed Muslims for the evils of idolatry, child marriage, and widow burning. His approach was ironic since Roy was educated in Muslim schools and was well acquainted with Muslim theology. Indeed, most of the Hindus in Calcutta rejected Roy's theology, and his friends were almost all Muslims. But Roy nevertheless began a practice that has continued. Hindus build their self-esteem by attacking Muslims. Roy probably never realized that he was pursuing a line that would have such fatal consequences. In Bombay, India's commercial metropolis, many organizations were created to promote sectarian religious interests. But the city's wealthy merchants came from all major religions. They formed political associations involving all the merchant elite, regardless of their faith. Bombay, for example, was the home of the grand old man of Indian nationalism, Dadabhai Naoroji. Naoroji belonged to the Parsi community, which was descended from 9th century Zoroastrian refugees from Persia. In other words, the Parsis were descendants of those who followed the ancient Persian religious prophet Zoroaster. The Parsis did well in Bombay, acquiring wealth and status as some of the city's greatest merchants. Naoroji was one of the first Indians to protest what became known as the Drain. This was the British government's constant use of Indian resources, especially its silver currency, to finance projects that did not benefit India. The Second Afghan War of 1878 was but one example. Many Indians criticized the British government for using Indian funds to support an imperial military adventure. The following complaint is typical.
All attention is engrossed in devising new modes of taxation without any adequate effort to increase the means of the people to pay. Financial relations between England and India are inequitable. There is a political debt of £100 million clapped on India's shoulders, while the British Exchequer contributes merely £3 million to the expenses of the colonies.
Naoroji also was a unique Indian politician for another reason. He used his residence in England to support his candidacy for Parliament, managing even to win a seat in that body. India's various local associations became more broadly organized when they joined to create a political organization called the Indian National Congress. 73 delegates met for the first time in Bombay in 1885. Though they were mostly self-appointed, the members believed they represented all of India's religions, provinces, and classes. Most delegates were lawyers, with a sprinkling of journalists and merchants. Almost all of them spoke English, so the proceedings of the Congress were conducted in that language. It was the only language which the delegates had in common. From its inception, the Indian National Congress has not been a political party in the European and American sense. It does not have a party ideology, nor does it have one agenda. Rather, the Congress is a platform for parties, a place where many different interests and constituencies can express themselves. In its early years, the Congress was a very moderate organization, only politely criticizing the policies of the British Raj. At the first session of the Congress, only 2 of the delegates were Muslim. The Congress often tried to encourage greater Muslim participation, but for most of the party's history, these efforts failed. One of the reasons for the Muslim lack of interest was that Sir Syed, himself a Muslim, strongly discouraged involvement in the organization. As he wrote in 1888,
Long before the idea of founding the Indian National Congress was mooted, I had given thought to the matter whether representative government is suited to the conditions of India. I reached the conclusion that the first requisite of a representative government is that the voters should possess the highest degree of homogeneity. I consider the experiment which the Indian National Congress wants to make fraught with dangers and suffering for all the nationalities of India, especially for the Muslims. The Muslims are in a minority.
Sir Syed believed that the best defense for Muslims was strict loyalty to the British, the only force which could safeguard Muslim political rights if the majority threatened them. Many Muslims agreed with Sir Syed, but only in 1906 did they organize their own platform for parties, the Muslim League. On the local and provincial level, other influential political trends emerged. In western India's province of Maharashtra, B.G. Tilak pioneered a new brand of populist politics. Unlike earlier moderate politicians like Dadabhai Naoroji, Tilak expressed his opposition to British rule in plain language.
One thing is granted, namely that this government does not suit us. One fact is that this alien government has ruined the country. Your industries are ruined utterly, ruined by foreign rule. Your wealth is going out of the country, and you are reduced to the lowest level which no human being can occupy. In this state of things, is there any remedy by which you can help yourself? The remedy is not petitioning, but boycott. We say prepare your forces, organize your power, and then go to work so that they cannot refuse you what you demand.
Tilak was one of the first politicians to recognize that religious symbolism has an important role in inspiring the mass of ordinary Indians. He popularized the Ganapati festival, a 10-day celebration in honor of the elephant-headed god Ganesh. Tilak helped make this event an expression of Maharashtrian greatness. He also chose to boost Hindu morale by railing against Muslims, as other leaders were doing. The Ganapati festival soon acquired a distinctly anti-Muslim purpose. Neighborhood crowds carried statues of the god in processions, invariably accompanied by bands, drummers, and noisy singing. Organizers made it a point to pass by mosques at prayer time. Muslim prayers were conducted quietly, and Muslims intensely resented any distraction from their devotions. A passing procession with its raucous music frequently brought Muslims out of their mosques to confront the revelers. Both groups soon exchanged insults, speculating on the marital status of parents or the lack of sexual virtue in mothers and sisters. Words quickly led to rock-throwing and fisticuffs. A riot could erupt in a matter of minutes. Inter-community violence became the dark side of India's quest for independence during the 19th century. But this violence had many puzzling complexities. Not every town or region was involved, but once a disturbance occurred, it was likely to happen again. On the surface, religious passions caused the conflicts, but in practice, individuals sometimes incited mob violence to act as a cover for personal revenge. A man might cause a riot to hide his settling of an old score against an enemy. Also, unemployment and underemployment have always been common in India. There are many restless young men with little to do, and they will eagerly take any job. Restless youths could be found in any market, and with a few well-placed rupees, one could rent a mob. These young toughs from the bazaar were often the nucleus of unruly riots. Mob violence in India, even today, tends to be cyclical. It will be intense for a relatively short time, and then people will tire of it. A town or region will then be quiet, sometimes for years, but eventually the trouble usually breaks out again. World War I marked a real turning point in India's history. At first, many prominent Indian politicians wholeheartedly supported the British. Among them was a rising star named Mohandas K. Gandhi. Gandhi, a lawyer trained in London, had made a name for himself leading protests against the poor treatment of Indians by the white settlers of South Africa. In South Africa, he had perfected the tactics of non-violent protest, including hunger strikes, courting arrest by defying the law, and accepting physical punishment for law-breaking. Gandhi returned to India in 1914 after a long absence, and he joined the other leaders in supporting the British war effort. He and others said that Britain's trouble should not be the occasion for India's political profit. Gandhi encouraged men to volunteer for the army, sold war bonds, and gave patriotic speeches. During the war, soldiers of the Indian Army fought in every major campaign. They were in the trenches of France, but they were most important in the battles against the Ottoman Turks in the Middle East. Though their contributions were important, Indian soldiers suffered from a number of disabilities not imposed on their British counterparts. Only the British troops received adequate rations and medical treatment. Many Indians died because they were denied proper food or access to hospitals. Still, Indian politicians tolerated such things in the hope that the British would appreciate India's contribution to the war effort. At the end of the war, politicians like Gandhi expected the British to reward their loyalty with political concessions. This would bring India much closer to the goals of self-government and independence, conditions enjoyed by other British dominions like Canada and Australia. The government did pass out a few war medals. Gandhi got one of them. But the Indian politicians who wanted liberal reforms got only tighter British control. The government imposed a set of repressive measures in 1919 called the Rowlatt Acts. These regulations harshly restricted freedom of the press and political activity in India. They allowed imprisonment without trial for political offenses, and they gave wide powers to the British bureaucracy to stifle almost all forms of dissent. Gandhi and other leaders began to organize a massive protest. Gandhi explained his conversion from loyalist to rebel.
I was a loyalist because I implicitly believed that the sum total of the activities of the British Empire was good for India and for humanity. After the outbreak of the war, I plunged into it. I led a recruiting campaign at the risk of my life and to the horror of some of my friends. The disillusionment came in 1919, after the passage of the Black Rowlatt Act and the refusal of the government to give the simple elementary redress of proved wrongs that we had asked for. And so, in 1920, I became a rebel.
The Gandhi of 1919 appeared to be very different from the man who had stepped off a boat from South Africa in 1914. He abandoned his bowler hat and stylish British suits, adopting the dress of an Indian holy man. He now wore a simple white cotton shirt and loincloth. Taking a cue from Tilak's use of popular religious symbolism, Gandhi couched his political statements in the language of Hindu religion. He acquired the title Mahatma, meaning great soul. His image as a living saint became so pervasive that people forgot that he was a hard-headed politician. He still could be a tough insider, pressuring opponents to accept his program. A generation of Muslim politicians had followed a policy of loyalty to the British crown. Now, in 1919, Gandhi sensed that younger Muslim leaders were unhappy with the results. Muslims were especially agitated because the Turkish Ottoman Empire was dismembered at the end of World War I. The Ottoman Sultan had claimed the title of Caliph, titular leader of the worldwide Muslim community. Now the Caliph was defeated. Gandhi engineered an alliance between the Indian National Congress and a group of young, rising Muslim leaders. He brought these Muslims into the Congress Party, inaugurating one of the few periods in which that party enjoyed substantial Muslim support. Using this Muslim influence, Gandhi persuaded the Congress to support what was called a non-cooperation movement. Gandhi encouraged all Indians to boycott British goods, and he linked it to the Muslim struggle to protect the Caliphate. As early as 1907, Aurobindo Ghosh, outlined the elements of this tactic.
We would not only buy our own goods, but boycott British goods. Not only have our own schools, but boycott government institutions. Have nothing to do with the bureaucratic executive except when we cannot avoid it. At present, the boycott is confined to British goods and aimed at the British merchant, and only indirectly at the British bureaucrat. We should aim it directly, both at the British merchant and at the British bureaucrat who stands behind him and makes possible the exploitation by the merchant.
Gandhi's own homespun clothing now became a symbol of protest. A new rallying cry emerged. Do not buy British cloth or yarn, instead spin your own. The papers reported that Gandhi spent an hour or two every day spinning his own thread. The simple spinning wheel now symbolized the Congress Party. Millions of Indians began spinning at home, though most of their thread proved useless, and British cloth continued to sell at near-normal levels. The leaders of the non-cooperation struggle made other defiant gestures toward the British. Gandhi and others returned their imperial medals and awards. They urged people to refuse to pay taxes and to avoid using the law courts. Indian politicians finally were sensing the power of the Indian masses. These leaders previously had courted princes, big landholders, and merchants to gain financial support for the Congress. Now they appealed directly to the masses for contributions of a rupee or even a half rupee per person. The masses responded and the money rolled in. Gandhi and others traveled all over India to address tens of thousands gathered in protests called monster meetings. Gandhi spread his image as a sort of poor, wandering holy man. Wherever he went, he traveled third class. He stayed only in the poorest neighborhoods. Few realized that his traveling companions and neighbors were all carefully selected by the Congress leadership. The treasurer of the Congress Party, Vallabhbhai Patel, lamented,
If only people knew how much money it cost the Congress to keep that man poor.
Gandhi saw the independence movement as a task of moral education. He thought Indians needed to be introduced to the principles of nonviolence and passive resistance.
I do justify entire non-violence and consider it possible in relations between man and nations. But it is not a resignation from all real fighting against wickedness. On the contrary, the non-violence of my conception is more active and more real fighting against wickedness than retaliation, whose very nature is to increase wickedness. I contemplate a mental and therefore a moral opposition to immoralities. I seek entirely to blunt the edge of the tyrant's sword, not by putting up against it a sharper-edged weapon, but by disappointing his expectation that I would offer physical resistance. The resistance of the soul that I should offer instead would elude him. It would at first dazzle him, and at last compel recognition from him, which recognition would not humiliate him, but would uplift him.
Time after time, Gandhi chastised unruly crowds. As for his allies, some were committed to Gandhi's methods only because they seemed to bring results. They didn't necessarily agree with Gandhi's glorification of India's village life and popular religion. Jawaharlal Nehru, who was to become India's first prime minister, was a religious agnostic. He had studied at Britain's Cambridge University, and there he had come to believe in the need for scientific and technological progress. Gandhi looked to India's villages for inspiration. Nehru saw a democratic industrial England as the model for India's future. Muslim leaders also were uneasy about Gandhi's overtly Hindu appeal. The Caliphate and non-cooperation movements came very close to ousting the British from India. But in the end, the movements broke apart. Not all Indians were committed to the same causes as Gandhi and the Muslim leaders. Few ordinary Indians would forsake their government jobs as clerks or policemen. People still used the law courts. British goods were purchased because they filled needs that Indian goods could not meet. In appealing to religious loyalties, political leaders of all persuasions unleashed a force they couldn't easily control. Poor Muslims on India's west coast became tired of waiting for results. They decided to establish their own caliphate. They attacked the British. They also attacked their oppressive landlords, most of whom were Hindus. Hindu women were forced to marry Muslim men. Hindu boys and men were circumcised against their will and made to eat beef. Hindus cried out for revenge. nationalist leaders ended up calling on the British government to stop the chaos. In January 1922, a mob attacked a police station in northern India, trapping 22 Indian policemen. The building was set on fire, killing all of the officers. After this incident, Gandhi decided that India was not ready for independence, that the populace required more education in the ways of nonviolence. He called off the non-cooperation struggle. At almost the same time, the revolutionary movement in Turkey deprived the Ottoman Sultan of his office. Eventually, the Turkish revolutionaries banished the Ottoman family to Switzerland. Without this spiritual leadership, Indian Muslims now lost the focus of their protest. India's own leadership began to fragment in an atmosphere of bickering, fault-finding, and mutual recrimination. By 1924, the independence movement that had begun with so many high hopes was a shambles. In the late 1920s and throughout the 30s, India's Muslim politics shifted to the provincial level. In Bengal and Punjab, both of which had slight Muslim majorities, leaders formed coalitions with other religious groups. In Bengal, the Peasants' and Workers' Party based its strength on the Hindu and Muslim masses. In Punjab, the Unionist Party brought together Hindu, Sikh, and Muslim landlords. The British encouraged these provincial coalitions because they didn't seriously challenge British control over the whole of India. India's Congress Party continued to struggle for national independence, but the Muslim League very nearly became extinct. A number of controversies continued to prevent agreement between nationalists and Muslims. Most important was the question of reserving legislative seats for Muslims. It was proposed that candidates for these special seats would run in separate, specifically Muslim electorates. Muslim leaders were not so much concerned about provinces that had Muslim majorities. Rather, they worried about the provinces where Muslims were only 5 to 10% of the population. Here, Muslims demanded not only separate electorates, but also weighted representation. They wanted more seats than their numbers would give them in a strictly democratic system. Most members of the National Congress belonged to the majority, so they had little sympathy for the Muslim point of view. They refused to make concessions and sometimes would not even meet with Muslim leaders. Disinterest bred distrust, and distrust led to anger or fear. In that tense situation, Muhammad Ali Jinnah ended a self-imposed exile in London. In 1935, he returned to India. Almost single-handedly, Jinnah revived the Muslim League. Other Muslim leaders who had dominated the movement in the 1920s were now either dead or forgotten. Jinnah became the sole spokesman for a new Muslim political identity. The Muslim League fared poorly in the 1935 elections, the first held under a new British-inspired constitution. But Jinnah kept up the struggle, and he soon would benefit from an event wholly outside his control: World War II. By 1940, the world was again engaged in a full-scale war. The British Viceroy declared that India would be in the war, but he failed to consult Gandhi, Nehru, or the other leaders of the Congress. In response, the Congress ordered all of its members to withdraw from the provincial governments as a protest. India's situation grew more tense with the Japanese onslaught in 1942. The British criticized a lack of loyalty from the Indian Congress. Gandhi responded,
India should be left to the Japanese or to chaos.
In the context of the war, the position of the Congress leaders seemed radical. However, a few Indian leaders, notably the Bengali politician Subhash Chandra Bose, took an even more radical stance. Bose had been the leader of the Bengal branch of the Congress Party, but he tired of their moderate approach. At the beginning of the war, he made his way out of India, through Afghanistan, and eventually reached Berlin. The Nazis saw in Bose a leader who could persuade thousands of Indian prisoners of war captured by the Germans in North Africa to fight against their former British masters. The Germans founded the Free India Legion as part of their effort to gain support from the POWs. The Legion attracted only 2,000 or 3,000 Indians, most of whom had been cooks or other support personnel. By and large, the Indian soldiers remained loyal to Britain. The situation in Southeast Asia was somewhat different. In their conquests of Malaya, Burma, and Singapore, the Japanese had bagged tens of thousands of Indian soldiers. Many of them were embittered because their British officers had sometimes abandoned them and fled before the Japanese. The Germans sent Bose to Japan on one of their U-boats. The Japanese accepted Bose as a leader of the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. This was the title for the new Asia they wished to create. The Japanese created the Indian National Army. several thousand Indians joined it. Some genuinely believed in the cause. Others saw a chance to escape the horrors of Japanese prison camps. In 1943, Boche gave the Indian National Army a rousing speech.
When France declared war on Germany in 1939 and the campaign began, there was but one cry which rose from the lips of German soldiers: "To Paris! To Paris!" When the brave soldiers of Nippon set out on their march in December 1941, there was but one cry which rose from their lips: "To Singapore! To Singapore!" Comrades, my soldiers, let your battle cry be: "To Delhi! To Delhi!"
The Indian National Army fought little, and it fought badly in eastern India. Many of the soldiers took the first chance they got to rejoin the British Indian Army. Boche was a failure. The British arrested him after the war, but the plane transporting him back to India crashed, and Boche was killed. Jinnah and the Muslim League remained loyal to the British, and they took over many important posts in the provincial governments. But, as we will see, their loyalty would not last long. By 1940, some Muslims had decided that the only way to guarantee their political rights was to demand an independent state. A young Muslim studying at Cambridge in England came up with a name for the country: Pakistan. Pakistan is an Urdu word meaning literally the land of the pure. The letters in the name also stand for the initial letters of the English names for the 5 predominantly Muslim provinces in the north and northwest part of the Indian subcontinent: Punjab, Afghania, Kashmir, Sindh, and Baluchistan. Though Bengal was the province with the largest number of Muslims, it was not even mentioned in this new word. Before the Second World War ended, Britain held a parliamentary election. The Labour Party won a stunning victory, and Winston Churchill did not return as Prime Minister. Indian independence was one of the planks in the Labour platform. So throughout 1946, after the war ended, British delegations negotiated with all the major Indian groups. These included the Muslim League, the Congress, the Sikhs, and the Indian princes. The British wanted to leave India united, and India's Congress had the same goal. But the Muslim League continued to hold out for a separate Muslim state, Pakistan. India formed an interim government under Nehru, but Jinnah allowed several prominent Muslim leaguers to join the cabinet, and they were obstructionists. They made the government ineffective. Their tactics began to convince most congressional leaders that partition was the only path to independence. Gandhi could not accept that possibility. He met with England's Lord Louis Mountbatten, suggesting that the Viceroy dismiss Nehru as Prime Minister and appoint Jinnah in his place. Nehru refused to comply, and many congressional leaders began to hint that Gandhi was just a bit senile. Nehru himself privately accepted the idea of a split. In a famous remark, he said,
Perhaps we must cut off the head to cure the headache.
In the meantime, killing was beginning throughout India. Where Muslims were strong, Hindus and Sikhs became victims. Where Muslims were weak, they were killed. Soon after becoming the last viceroy, Lord Louis Mountbatten announced that August 15, 1947 was the target date for partition and independence. As the date of independence approached, Hindus and Muslims began the greatest human migration in history, in both Punjab and Bengal. Especially in the regions closest to the new border, Hindus packed their belongings and struggled to get to India. Muslims similarly moved to Pakistan. Columns of refugees moved in opposite directions, and sometimes they attacked each other. Trains loaded with refugees were stopped, and the riders brutally murdered. Railway carriages filled with the dead and dying pulled into stations on both sides of the border. In a popular history of these events, the writers Larry Collins and Dominique Lapierre captured such scenes in the following description.
For hundreds of thousands of Punjabis, the first instinctive reflex action in the cataclysm shaking their province was to rush toward the little brick and tile buildings that offered, in each important town, a reassuring symbol of organization and order, the railroad station. Now, in the late summer of 1947, trains would become, for hundreds of thousands of Indians, the best hope of fleeing the nightmares around them. For tens of thousands of others, they would become rolling coffins. Crushed under that load of misery, with the odor of coal smoke overwhelmed by the stench of sweating bodies, with their whistle shrieks drowned by the shouts of the wretches they carried, the trains rolled off, bearing their pitiful burdens to death or to a promised land.
No one knows how many died. Some say 500,000, others 1,000,000. Still others say 2 million or more. Despite all the bloodshed, recriminations, and uncertainties, both Pakistan and India entered the international arena in August of 1947. Muhammad Ali Jinnah addressed the Constituent Assembly of Pakistan in a way that seemed to question the Muslim character of the new state.
You are free. You are free to go to your temples. You are free to go to your mosques or any other places of worship in this state of Pakistan. You may belong to any religion, caste or creed. That has nothing to do with the business of the state. We are starting with this principle that we are all citizens and equal citizens of one state. Now I think that we should keep this in front of us as our ideal, and you will find that in the course of time, Hindus will cease to be Hindus and Muslims would cease to be Muslims. Not in the religious sense, because that is the personal faith of each individual, but the political sense as citizens of the state.
Jawaharlal Nehru spoke to the Indian Parliament about destiny and history.
Long years ago, we made a tryst with destiny. And now the time comes when we shall redeem our pledge. Not wholly or in full measure, but very substantially. At the stroke of the midnight hour, when the world sleeps, India will awake to life and freedom. A moment comes but rarely in history when we step out from the old to the new, when an age ends, and when the soul of a nation long suppressed finds utterance. The service of India means the service of the millions who suffer. It means the ending of poverty and ignorance and disease and inequality of opportunity.
Nehru described his goals by referring to the ambition of Gandhi.
The ambition of the greatest man of our generation has been to wipe every tear from every eye. That may be beyond us, but as long as there are tears and suffering, so long our work will not be over.
Neither side was happy with the terms of the partition. Jinnah referred to this moth-eaten Pakistan, but he could do little to challenge the final division of the spoils. Moreover, Jinnah was suffering from an acute case of tuberculosis, and it was to kill him within the year. In India, Gandhi tried to win the support of the Muslims. He expressed sympathy for Muslim victims of communal violence. But this earned him the contempt of Hindu extremists. They began to call him Muhammad Gandhi, or Jinnah's slave. One young Hindu fundamentalist took these charges seriously. On January 30th, 1948, he stepped in front of Gandhi and fired 5 bullets into his chest. Muttering the name of one of the Hindu gods, Ram, Gandhi sank to the ground and died. For a time, the nation was so shocked that Gandhi's communal ideals retreated to the background. They would return to plague India when the mourning for Gandhi was finished. Mahatma Gandhi's death was only the first in a series of political murders that have plagued both India and Pakistan since their independence. In Pakistan, Liaquat Ali Khan, Jinnah's protege, was gunned down in 1951. In 1977, a military coup removed Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, and 2 years later he was hanged on a charge of planning the death of one of his rivals. General Zia-ul-Haq, the man who overthrew Bhutto, died in a 1988 plane crash that most people believed to be sabotage. In India, Indira Gandhi was the daughter of India's first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru. She, coincidentally, had the married name Gandhi, but was not related to the Mahatma. She became Prime Minister in 1966, only to be shot and killed by 2 of her Sikh bodyguards in 1984. Her son Rajiv succeeded her and served as Prime Minister until 1989. But he too was assassinated when a bomb exploded at his feet during a 1991 campaign to again become Prime Minister. Tragically, political violence had become a way of life in 20th century India and Pakistan. When Pakistan came into being in 1947, it consisted of two regions, West Pakistan and East Pakistan. The eastern wing was separated from the rest of the country by more than 1,000 miles of Indian territory. Moreover, most of East Pakistanis spoke the Bengali language, which was unrelated to the languages of the western portion of the country. East Pakistanis were Muslims, but they wrote their language in an Indian script, not the Arabic script used for Urdu, Punjabi, and the other West Pakistani tongues. Their culture was also quite different from that of their fellow countrymen. Political and economic tensions soon emerged between Pakistan's two branches. Most Pakistanis were the Bengali Muslims in East Pakistan, but they were not proportionally represented in the National Assembly, which met in West Pakistan. At that time, the Bengali wing produced the only Pakistani export that earned foreign currency, jute, a fiber used to make burlap and rope. Rather than using these foreign earnings to build East Pakistan's industries, West Pakistan milked the profits to further its own economic development. East Pakistanis became more and more alienated, and they began to think of themselves as a mere colony of the western section. This led to civil war in 1971. India decided to aid the East Pakistanis. Its army defeated the West Pakistani forces stationed in eastern Bengal. A new country thus was created when East Pakistan became Bangladesh. This traumatic event caused many Pakistanis to wonder if their nation could survive at all. Lawrence Ziering, an American political scientist, has evaluated those events and their influence on Pakistan.
The casting aside of older political forms for newer political experiments is a critical feature of the Pakistan story. Moreover, events are cumulative. The past influences the present, and together they shape the future. The endemic political instability in Pakistan, the inability to realize a common political ethos, the constant groping for identity, has taken its toll on the body politic. Indeed, the loss of East Pakistan in 1971 continues to reverberate. More than territory and a large Muslim population were separated from the original Pakistan design. The dream and the ideal of a great unified Muslim nation were seriously undermined by that catastrophic civil war. Some might say they had been destroyed.
Since 1947, both India and Pakistan have experienced internal strife. As both countries near the end of the 20th century, they face a broad array of domestic problems. Each has separatist movements based on political coalitions that tend to break down easily. Both India and Pakistan have developing economies which strive to, but cannot yet, dramatically improve the lives of the masses. Each country perceives a threat in the other. Pakistanis view Indians as possible conquerors, poised to eliminate their nation. For Indians, Pakistan is a thorn in the side. It constantly challenges India's desire to become not only South Asia's dominant power, but a world leader. Arnold Toynbee once wrote of the Balkans that they produce more history than they can consume locally. This means that trouble eventually draws outsiders into any internal disputes. The same thing could be said about India and Pakistan. Though they became nations in 1947, both nations have culturally and religiously diverse populations, and they have many centuries of traditions, many of them foreboding. Nevertheless, there are a few hopeful signs. Leaders in Pakistan and India occasionally have developed cordial, personal relationships. The people of both nations have a long common history. Leaders can find in that history examples of cooperation and peaceful contact. Some leaders have shown a preference for moderation and negotiation when serious troubles arise. Yet none can know with certainty whether their domestic struggles and their international tensions will be controlled. Many Indians and Pakistanis hope for peace, even as they fear conflicts that may provoke a war with global consequences.
We hope you have enjoyed this presentation of India and Pakistan by Knowledge Products. The script for this presentation is by Dr. Gregory C. Kozlowski, Professor of History, DePaul University. The script is edited by Wendy McElroy and produced by Pat Childs. Vocal characterizations are by Rob Daniel, Charles Duval, Pat Childs, Jim Gossett, Travis Hardison, Sami Ismail, Ghazi Khankan, Bill Kulki, Paul Meyer, Reza Ordubadian, Brajendra Prasad, and Amarjeet Singh Shahid. Music is by Ralph Childs. Recorded at Audio Reader, New York Audio, and Archer Productions. This material may not be copied in whole or in part without the written permission of the copyright owner. Copyright 1992 by Carmichael & Carmichael Incorporated. This presentation of the world's political hotspots is a part of the Audio Classics series. This continuing series of audio presentations discusses the great ideas and events of history in their historical and intellectual context.
Audible hopes you have enjoyed this program.